The deep space monitoring station, Aegis Point, hung in the darkness between stars like a metal spider waiting for prey that never came. Captain Lee Jun walked through the empty corridors and listened to the soft hum of life support systems that kept his small crew alive in the cold vacuum of space. 3 years they had been stationed here, and 3 years of watching empty space had made them all a little crazy. Dr. Park Hana sat at her console in the communications center and stared at screens full of static and noise. She was supposed to be listening for alien transmissions or enemy signals, but mostly she just heard the background radiation of the universe talking to itself. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced ease while her mind wandered to thoughts of home and warm Earth sunsets she had not seen in so long. Lieutenant Kim Tae was in the navigation room, plotting courses to nowhere and checking star charts that never changed. He had joined the colonial fleet to see the galaxy, but all he had seen so far was the inside of this station and the same view of distant stars through the observation windows. Engineer Yu Bin spent her days maintaining systems that barely needed maintenance and fixing problems that did not exist just to have something to do. It was a Tuesday morning by ship time when Park Hana noticed something different in the quantum static. At first she thought it was just another equipment malfunction or maybe solar interference from a nearby star system. The pattern was too regular to be natural noise, but too faint to be anything important. She adjusted the receivers and boosted the signal strength until the pattern became clearer. The transmission was encrypted with quantum keys that made her equipment scream warnings about unauthorized access. Park Hana ignored the warnings and ran the signal through every decryption program she had. The message was not meant for human ears and was traveling along communication channels that Earth had never used. Someone was broadcasting on frequencies that the human colonies did not even monitor. After 2 hours of work, she broke through the first layer of encryption and found text in a language she had never seen before. The symbols looked like mathematics mixed with poetry, and the grammar made no sense to her trained linguistic mind. Park Hana called Captain Lee Jun to the communications center and showed him what she had found. Lee Jun looked at the alien, text scrolling across the screen, and felt a chill run down his spine. In his 10 years with the colonial fleet, he had never seen actual proof that other intelligent species existed. Earth scientists had theorized about alien life for centuries, but finding real evidence was something else entirely. The message was clearly artificial and clearly from a source that was not human. Park Hana worked through the night to decode more of the transmission, while Lee Jun paced the station corridors and wondered what they should do. The message was not addressed to Earth or any human colony, and intercepting alien communications could be considered an act of war by species they knew nothing about. But the scientist in him was too curious to ignore what might be the most important discovery in human history. By morning, Park Hana had translated enough of the message to understand its basic meaning. The transmission was from a species that called themselves the Keth, and they were in terrible danger. Their home star was dying, in a process that their scientists could not stop or slow down. The planet was becoming uninhabitable, and their entire civilization would be extinct within days unless someone came to rescue them. The message was addressed to something called the Great Protectors, which seemed to be some kind of galactic federation or alliance that the humans had never heard of. The Keth were begging for evacuation ships and emergency assistance, but their tone suggested they did not expect help to come. They had been broadcasting the same plea for weeks according to the transmission logs, and no one had responded. Lieutenant Kim Tae ran the coordinates that were embedded in the Keith message and found that their star system was only 3 hyperspace jumps away from Aegis Point. The distance was close enough for human ships to travel in less than a day, but apparently too remote for these great protectors to care about. The Keth were calling into the void, and the void was not answering back. Engineer Yu Bin analyzed the technical data in the Keth transmission and found details about their dying star that made her stomach turn. The stellar core was collapsing, in a cascade reaction that would end in a supernova explosion. The Keth had perhaps 48 hours before their entire solar system was consumed by nuclear fire. After that, there would be nothing left but expanding plasma and radiation. Park Hana translated more of the message and found personal appeals from individual Keth, who were saying goodbye to loved ones and asking the universe to remember their species after they were gone. One message was from Keth parents who wrote that they knew they were forgotten, but their children deserved to live. Another was from Keth scientists who were sharing their research data so that someone might learn from their discoveries after their civilization was destroyed. The four humans sat in the station conference room and stared at each other across a table covered with alien text and stellar analysis reports. They were just a monitoring outpost with no authority to make first contact with alien species, and no resources to mount a rescue mission even if they wanted to. Their job was to watch and listen and report back to Colonial Command not to interfere. In galactic politics they did not understand. But the Keth messages kept coming with increasing desperation as their star continued to collapse. Park Hana translated a transmission from Keth children who were asking their parents why the sky was getting brighter and why the ground kept shaking. The innocence in those words hit the humans like a physical blow and made them realize that 2.3 million intelligent beings were about to die while the galaxy watched and did nothing. Li Jun stood up from the conference table and walked to the observation window, where he could see the stars scattered across the darkness, like diamonds on black silk. Somewhere out there, the Keth were counting down the hours until their world ended, and somewhere else, the Great Protectors were deciding that some lives were not worth saving. The choice facing him was simple in concept, but terrible in its implications. He could follow regulations and report the intercept to Colonial Command, where it would disappear into bureaucratic committees and diplomatic channels that moved too slowly to save anyone. Or he could take action that might start a war with alien powers but might also save an entire species from extinction. The decision would define not just his career but possibly the future relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. Li Jun turned back to his crew and saw the same conflict in their eyes that he felt in his heart. They were soldiers and explorers who had joined the colonial fleet to serve humanity and protect human interests. But they were also moral beings who could not ignore suffering when they had the power to act. The Keth had never heard of humans, and humans had never heard of the Keth, but that did not make their lives less valuable. The captain walked to the communications console and opened a channel to the colonial fleet headquarters on Earth. He would request permission to mount a rescue mission, even though he already knew what the answer would be. Earth Command would never authorize an unauthorized first contact mission that could destabilize their position in a galaxy they barely understood. The political risks were too high, and the potential consequences too severe. But if Earth Command said no, then Li Jun would have to decide whether to follow orders or follow his conscience. The Keth were dying, and the Great Protectors were not coming, and someone had to act before it was too late. He looked at Park Hana and Kim Tae and Yu Bin and saw that they understood the choice they were facing. They were about to discover whether humanity deserved a place among the stars. The holographic image of Admiral Cho Sang flickered in the communications room of Aegis Point as quantum static interfered with the transmission from Earth. His weathered face showed the skepticism that Li Jun had expected when he reported the alien intercept and requested permission to mount a rescue mission. The Admiral listened to the full briefing without interruption, but his expression grew more concerned with each detail about the dying Keth civilization. Cho Sang had commanded the colonial fleet for 15 years and had seen enough disasters to know when his officers were asking for the impossible. The human colonies barely had enough resources to supply their own settlements, and certainly could not spare 3 colony ships for an unauthorized rescue mission. The political implications were even worse because interfering in galactic affairs could bring retaliation from alien powers that humanity was not prepared to fight. The Admiral studied the translation data that Park Hana had compiled, and the HFY stellar analysis that showed the Keth star system collapsing toward supernova. The science was solid, and the threat was real, but that did not change the fundamental problem that humans lacked the authority to act as galactic peacekeepers. Earth had spent 2 centuries establishing colonies and building defenses without making contact with alien civilizations, and that isolation had kept humanity safe from wars they could not win. Li Jun argued that the Keth situation was different because no other species was responding to their distress calls, and human intervention might actually improve Earth's standing with other galactic powers. If humanity could save an entire civilization, then other species might view humans as valuable allies rather than primitive upstarts who needed to be controlled or eliminated. The rescue mission could be the first step toward establishing Earth as a legitimate member of the galactic community. But Cho-Sang pointed out that humans knew nothing about galactic politics or the reasons why the Great Protectors were not responding to the Keth distress calls. Perhaps the Keth were criminals or enemies that deserved their fate, or perhaps saving them would violate some galactic law that humans did not understand. Interfering in affairs they knew nothing about could make humanity enemies of powers they had never heard of and could not hope to defeat. The argument continued for 2 hours while the Keth star continued its collapse and moved closer to the point of no return. Park Hana monitored the alien transmissions and reported that the messages were becoming more desperate as geological disasters increased on the Keth homeworld. Massive earthquakes were destroying their cities while volcanic eruptions filled the atmosphere with ash that blocked out their sun. The planet was dying even before the star exploded, and time was running out faster than anyone had calculated. Dr. Nam-Soo arrived at Aegis Point during the debate after being summoned from the nearby research station where she studied alien biology and xenological theory. She had spent her career preparing for the day when humanity would make contact with alien life, but she had never expected it to happen under such desperate circumstances. The Keth biological data in their transmissions showed that they were silicon-based life forms that could survive in conditions that would kill humans, but they were still vulnerable to radiation and extreme heat. Nam-Soo studied the Keth communications and found cultural details that made their situation even more tragic. They were a peaceful species that had never developed military technology or space combat capabilities because they had never encountered hostile aliens in their region of the galaxy. Their entire civilization was built around art and science and philosophy, with no preparation for evacuation or survival in space. They had built orbital stations for research but nothing capable of interstellar travel or long-term habitation. Lieutenant Kim Tae ran tactical simulations to determine whether human ships could actually reach the Keth system and extract their population before the supernova occurred. The numbers were not encouraging because human colony ships were designed for transporting willing passengers over established routes, not for emergency evacuations from hostile environments. The Keth planet was experiencing massive atmospheric disturbances that would make landing dangerous, and their population was scattered across multiple continents with no central coordination. Engineer Yu Bin analyzed the technical requirements for converting colony ships into rescue vessels and found that the modifications were theoretically possible, but would push human technology beyond safe operating parameters. The life support systems would need to handle 3 times their normal capacity, while the propulsion systems would need to make rapid jumps between hyperspace coordinates without the usual safety checks and preparation time. The breakthrough came when Kim Tae discovered something unexpected in his analysis of human versus alien technology. While human ships were primitive compared to what the Great Protectors probably used, they were actually better suited for this specific type of mission. Human colony ships were built to carry large populations over long distances with maximum reliability and minimum comfort. The advanced alien vessels were probably designed for speed and efficiency rather than bulk transportation. Yu Bin realized that human engineers had solved problems that more advanced species had never needed to face. Earth colonies were established. By moving millions of people across interstellar distances in ships that could operate independently for months, without resupply or maintenance. The technology was crude, but it was exactly what the Keth evacuation required. Human ships could carry more refugees than sleek alien vessels, and could survive the kind of damage that might disable more sophisticated craft. Nam-Soo provided the final piece of the puzzle when she analyzed Keth biology and found that their silicon-based metabolism meant they required different atmospheric conditions than humans. The life support modifications would be complex but manageable because Keth could survive in lower oxygen environments and could tolerate temperature variations that would kill human passengers. This meant that human ships could carry more Keth refugees than human colonists in the same space. The debate reached its climax when Park Hana translated a new transmission from the Keth that contained a message from their children. Young Keth, who did not understand why their world was ending, had recorded farewell messages to any species that might find them after the supernova. They spoke about their dreams and their artwork and their hope that someone in the galaxy would remember that they had existed and that they had tried to be good people. Cho-sang listened to the translated children's messages and felt something break inside his military discipline. He had joined the colonial fleet to protect humanity, but he had never forgotten that protection sometimes meant doing what was right, even when it was not safe or profitable. The Keth were not human, but they were intelligent beings who deserved the same chance at survival that humans would want if their positions were reversed. The Admiral made his decision and authorized the immediate deployment of 3 colony ships to attempt the Keth evacuation. The new Seoul and Busan Hope and Daejeon Runner would be converted to rescue configuration and launched within 12 hours. Lee Jun would command the mission with full authority to make tactical decisions without waiting for approval from Earth. Command. If the mission succeeded, then humanity would take credit for saving a civilization, but if it failed, then Earth would disavow all knowledge of the unauthorized operation. Yubin began the modifications to convert the colony ships into rescue vessels while Namsu prepared the biological support systems needed to keep Keth refugees alive during transport. Kim Tae plotted the fastest possible route to the Keth system and calculated hyperspace jump coordinates that would minimize travel time, even if they increased the risk of navigation errors. Captain Oh Min took command of the Busan Hope while Captain Bae Wan assumed control of the Daejeon Runner. Both officers were experienced colony transport commanders who understood the challenges of moving large populations across interstellar distances. They had never attempted an emergency evacuation from a dying world, but their expertise in managing crowded ships would be essential for the mission's success. Park. Hana continued monitoring Keth transmissions and found that their situation was deteriorating faster than the stellar collapse models had predicted. The planet's magnetic field was weakening as the dying star's radiation increased, and this was causing massive atmospheric disruption. The Keth had perhaps 36 hours before conditions became unsurvivable, even without the supernova explosion. The 3 human ships launched from their orbital stations and jumped into hyperspace while their crews worked frantically to complete the rescue modifications during transit. They were racing against stellar physics and cosmic forces that did not care about their heroic intentions. The Keth were dying, and the humans were coming, but whether they could arrive in time was a question that only time could answer. Lee Jun stood on the bridge of the New Seoul and watched the hyperspace coordinates count down toward their destination. His crew was preparing for the most important mission in human history, and possibly the last mission any of them would ever fly. They were about to discover whether courage and determination could overcome impossible odds, or whether some problems were too big for any species to solve. The rescue fleet pushed deeper into space well. The human rescue fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Keth system and immediately detected the electromagnetic chaos of a civilization in collapse. Captain Lee Jun watched his sensors struggle to map the system as radiation from the dying star interfered with their equipment and painted false readings across his displays. The Keth homeworld hung in space like a wounded animal, while its parent star pulsed with the irregular rhythms of stellar death. Dr. Nam Su had never seen anything like the readings coming from the Keth planet. Massive earthquakes were reshaping the continental plates while volcanic eruptions threw millions of tons of ash into an atmosphere that was already superheated by increasing solar radiation. The ocean levels were rising from thermal expansion, while the planet's magnetic field fluctuated wildly and allowed deadly radiation to reach the surface in concentrated bursts. Lieutenant Kim Tae plotted an approach vector that would keep the human ships outside the worst radiation zones while still allowing them to establish orbit around the dying world. The navigation was complicated by debris fields from Keth orbital stations that had been destroyed by solar flares and by the gravitational distortions caused by the unstable star. Every few minutes, another surge of radiation would sweep across the system and force the ships to adjust their positions. Park Hana established communication with the Keth by broadcasting on the same frequencies they had been using for their distress calls. The response was immediate and overwhelming as hundreds of Keth voices tried to speak at once through communication systems that were failing under the stress of planetary disaster. She worked to filter the signals and establish contact with whoever was coordinating the Keth response to their crisis. The voice that emerged from the chaos belonged to Keth leader Voss, who was broadcasting from what remained of their planetary capital. His words came through the translation system with the desperate hope of someone who had given up expecting rescue, but could not stop asking for help. He assumed that the human ships were advanced scouts for the Great Protectors, and began providing evacuation coordinates and population counts for the rescue operation. Lee Jun had to explain through the struggling translation system that the humans were not representatives of the Great Protectors and were not part of any galactic authority. They had intercepted the Keth distress calls by accident and had come to help on their own initiative without orders or official authorization. The concept seemed to confuse Voss, who kept asking what political advantage humans hoped to gain from the rescue operation. The first visual contact with the Keth came when Voss transmitted image data from the planet's surface. The aliens appeared as walking crystal formations that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns that shifted as they moved. Their bodies were translucent silicon structures that grew like living gemstones, with surfaces that sparkled in colors that human eyes had never seen. They were perhaps the most beautiful life forms that humanity had ever encountered, but they were also clearly fragile beings who were never meant to survive in hostile environments. Dr. Namsu studied the biological data and confirmed that Keth physiology was based on silicon chemistry rather than carbon, like human life. They could survive in atmospheric conditions that would suffocate humans, but they were vulnerable to physical shock and radiation damage. Their crystalline bodies could crack under stress, and their internal structure could be disrupted by electromagnetic fields. They were perfect for their peaceful homeworld, but completely unprepared for the violence of stellar collapse. Captain Omin took the Busan Hope into low orbit and began scanning for Keth population centers, while Captain Baywan positioned the Dejun Runner to cover the other side of the planet. The survey revealed that 2.3 million Keth were scattered across 6 continents, with the largest concentration in underground cities that were partially protected from the surface disasters. But even the deep shelters were failing as seismic activity increased and geothermal systems overloaded. Engineer Yu Bin worked with her team to adapt the human transport systems for Keth physiology. The refugees would need different atmospheric mixtures and temperature controls, but the basic life support requirements were manageable. The bigger problem was the sheer number of beings who needed evacuation and the limited time available to extract them from a planet that was becoming more dangerous every hour. The rescue operation began with the most accessible Keth populations. Near the planet's equator, where the atmospheric conditions were still marginally stable, human shuttles descended through the turbulent atmosphere, while Keth ground teams guided them to landing zones that were clear of volcanic activity and seismic instability. The first refugees to board the human ships were Keth scientists and engineers who could help coordinate the larger evacuation effort. Among the first evacuees was young Keth Neela, whose crystalline body sparkled with patterns that indicated curiosity and wonder rather than fear. She was fascinated by the human rescuers and asked countless questions through the translation system about their species and their motivations. When Namsu tried to explain why humans had come to help people they had never met, Neela seemed puzzled by the concept of altruistic action. The cultural exchange revealed fundamental differences between human and galactic civilization. The Keth had been part of a galactic community, where species helped each other only when ordered to do so by higher authorities or when they received direct compensation for their efforts. The idea that one species would risk their own ships and lives to save strangers without political gain was completely foreign to their understanding of how civilized beings behaved. Voss transmitted more details about galactic politics and explained that the Great Protectors were an alliance of ancient species who maintained order through a complex hierarchy of obligations and rewards. Younger species like the Keth were expected to serve the interests of older civilizations in exchange for protection and technological advancement. But the Keth were apparently too remote and too primitive to be worth the cost of a rescue operation. The evacuation proceeded slowly as human shuttles made repeated trips between the ships and the planet's surface, while radiation levels continued to increase. Each trip became more dangerous as solar flares interfered with navigation systems and atmospheric turbulence made landing increasingly difficult. Several shuttles suffered damage from electromagnetic pulses, but the human crews continued flying until their equipment failed completely. Kim Tae coordinated the orbital operations and watched the sensor readings that showed the Keth star moving closer to critical collapse. The stellar core was compressing under its own gravity, while fusion reactions became unstable and produced massive energy surges. The mathematical models indicated that they had perhaps 18 hours before the supernova began, and maybe 6 hours after that, before the expanding shockwave destroyed everything in the inner system. The logistical challenges became overwhelming. As more Keth were evacuated and the human ships filled beyond their design capacity, the life support systems were running at maximum output, while the structural integrity of the vessels was stressed by carrying 3 times their normal passenger load. Yu Bin and her engineering teams worked around the clock to maintain critical systems while the ships groaned under loads they were never meant to carry. Neela became an unofficial ambassador between the species, as she helped other young Keth adapt to life aboard human ships. Her natural curiosity made her an excellent translator for concepts that did not exist in either language, and she seemed to understand human motivations better than the adult Keth, who were still confused by the rescue operation. She told Nam-Su that Keth children were taught that the universe was orderly and logical, but humans seemed to act from emotional rather than rational motivations. The breakthrough in understanding came when Neela asked Nam-Su why sky strangers would save people when the great ones would not. The simple question cut through all the cultural confusion and reached the heart of what made humans different from other galactic species. Nam-Su's response that it was simply the right thing to do resonated with something deep in Keth philosophy that had been suppressed by their integration into galactic civilization. Boss transmitted a message to all Keth explaining what he had learned about human motivations, and the broadcast spread across their communication networks like wildfire. The idea that moral action could exist without external authority or reward challenged everything the Keth had been taught about how civilized beings behaved. Some Keth began to wonder whether their integration into galactic society had cost them something essential about their own nature. The evacuation entered its final phase as the last Keth population centers were reached, and the most remote refugees were brought aboard the overcrowded human ships. The vessels were now carrying nearly 1 million beings each, and every system was operating beyond safe parameters. The atmosphere recyclers were working at maximum capacity, while the artificial gravity generators struggled to maintain stable fields throughout the expanded habitation areas. Solar activity reached critical levels as the Keth star entered the final stages of collapse and began producing radiation bursts that could penetrate ship shielding. The human Kree engineer Lee Da arrived aboard the New Sol just as the evacuation entered its most critical phase. She had been transferred from the Colonial Engineering Depot with specialized equipment for managing overcrowding emergencies, but even her extensive experience had not prepared her for the sight of human ships packed beyond any reasonable safety limit. The corridors were filled with crystalline Keth refugees who sparkled in the artificial light, while human crew members worked frantically to keep life support systems functioning. The mathematics of survival were becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Lee Jun stood in the ship's conference room and studied the reports that showed 18 hours remaining before the Keth star reached supernova, while barely half of the planetary population had been evacuated. The 3 human ships were already carrying 3 times their normal capacity, and their life support systems were showing strain warnings that could not be ignored much longer. Dr. Nam-Su worked with Keth engineer Toth to find solutions that neither species could achieve alone. Toth's crystalline body contained computational abilities that interfaced directly with the ship's computer systems in ways that amazed the human engineers. His silicon-based neural structure could process multiple data streams simultaneously, while maintaining perfect accuracy in calculations that would overwhelm human cognitive abilities. The collaboration revealed that Keth biology had advantages that nobody had considered during the initial evacuation planning. Their silicon metabolism required significantly less oxygen than human respiratory systems, and they could survive in atmospheric conditions that would quickly kill carbon-based life. This meant that the ships could support more Keth refugees. then human passengers in the same space if the environmental controls were properly adjusted. Engineer Yu Bin and Li Da worked together to reconfigure the life support systems for mixed species operation. The process required shutting down entire sections of the ship while they modified atmospheric processors and temperature controls. The work was dangerous because any mistake could kill hundreds of refugees, but it was the only way to accommodate the remaining Keth population before the stellar explosion made evacuation impossible. Captain Oh Min pushed the Busan Hope deeper into the Keth atmosphere to reach underground cities that were still accessible despite increasing volcanic activity. The ship's hull glowed from atmospheric friction, while radiation alarms sounded continuously in the bridge. His crew flew through ash clouds and electromagnetic storms to reach Keth shelters that were failing as seismic activity increased and geothermal systems overloaded. Captain Bei Wan coordinated the orbital evacuation stations that transferred refugees from surface shuttles to the overcrowded colony ships. The operation required perfect timing, as each ship could only remain in low orbit for limited periods before radiation exposure became lethal. Every minute counted as more Keth were brought aboard vessels that were already stressed beyond their design limits. The discovery that changed everything came when young Neela showed Dr. Nam Su how Keth could enter a form of biological hibernation that dramatically reduced their life support requirements. The process was similar to crystallization, where their silicon bodies entered a dormant state that required minimal atmospheric processing and temperature control. A hibernating Keth needed only 1/10 the resources of an active individual. Namsu realized that hibernation could allow the human ships to carry nearly the entire Keth population if they could modify the cargo holds and maintenance areas to serve as temporary dormancy chambers. The process would be uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, but it offered the only realistic hope of evacuating everyone before the supernova deadline. The Keth would essentially be stored like cargo during the journey to safety. Keth engineer Toth worked with the human engineering teams to design hibernation systems that could support thousands of dormant refugees. The technical challenge was enormous because the systems needed to maintain precise environmental conditions while occupying minimal space aboard ships that were already overcrowded. Every available compartment was converted to house hibernating Keth, while their active population was reduced to essential personnel only. The hibernation process began with the eldest Keth, who were least able to survive the stress of active evacuation. One by one they entered the crystalline dormancy that made them appear like beautiful sculptures rather than living beings. Their bodies became translucent, and their inner light dimmed to barely visible levels, while their metabolic processes slowed to near zero. The sight was hauntingly beautiful and deeply disturbing. Lieutenant Kim Tae monitored the stellar collapse and reported that the timeline was accelerating beyond all previous predictions. The Keth star was losing mass through solar wind at rates that indicated core collapse would begin within 12 hours, rather than the 18 they had hoped for. The mathematical model showed that they would need to begin final evacuation procedures immediately, or risk being caught in the expanding supernova shockwave. The race against stellar death entered its final phase as the last Keth population centers reported readiness for evacuation. Underground cities that had protected the aliens from surface disasters were now becoming death traps as seismic activity increased and structural supports failed. Emergency broadcasts from the planet's surface described evacuation sites where thousands of Keth waited for rescue while their world collapsed around them. Oh Min flew the Busan Hope through increasingly dangerous atmospheric conditions to reach the most remote Keth shelters. His ship's hull was scarred by volcanic debris, while his sensors struggled to navigate through electromagnetic interference from solar radiation. The crew worked in environmental suits as radiation levels exceeded safe exposure limits, but they continued flying because abandoning the remaining refugees was not an option they could accept. The final evacuation runs required split-second timing, as shuttles landed at sites that were being destroyed even as the refugees boarded. Volcanic eruptions and massive earthquakes made every landing dangerous, while increasing radiation made every flight potentially lethal. Human pilots pushed their equipment beyond safe operating parameters while Keth ground teams guided them to survivors who were trapped in collapsing shelters. Engineer Li Da discovered that the new Sol's structural integrity was approaching critical failure from the massive overload of refugees and equipment. The ship's framework was never designed to carry such enormous loads, and stress fractures were appearing in key structural members. The vessel could catastrophically fail if they attempted to jump to hyperspace while carrying so many passengers. The solution came from an unexpected source when Keth engineer Toth revealed that their hibernation fields could actually strengthen the ship's structure by creating a crystalline matrix that distributed loads more evenly. The dormant refugees would become part of the ship's support system, rather than just cargo being transported. The concept violated every principle of human engineering, but the mathematics were undeniable. Yu Bin and Li Da worked with Toth to implement the structural hibernation system while the final refugees were brought aboard. The process required precise coordination between human technology and Keth biology, as thousands of dormant aliens were positioned throughout the ship to create a living framework that could survive hyperspace travel. The ships became hybrid vessels that were part machine and part organism. The evacuation reached completion just as the Keth star entered the final stage of collapse and began producing radiation levels that would sterilize the entire inner system within hours. The 3 human ships were now carrying nearly the entire Keth civilization in hibernation chambers and cargo holds that had been converted to support alien life. Every available space was occupied while life support systems ran at maximum capacity. Captain Li Jun faced the final impossible decision as sensor readings showed that the stellar explosion would begin before all ships could reach minimum safe distance. The mathematics were clear that one vessel would need to remain behind to ensure the others could escape with their refugee cargo. The ship that stayed would be destroyed by the expanding shockwave, but their sacrifice would allow the other 2 vessels to carry the Keth survivors to safety. The choice was made without discussion as Li Jun quietly ordered the new soul to take the final evacuation run, while the Busan Hope and Daejeon Runner began their escape to hyperspace. His crew understood what their captain had decided, and they continued their work without complaint or protest. They would save as many Keth as possible, even if it meant their own destruction. Kim Tae plotted the escape trajectory that would give the refugee ships the best chance of survival, while the new soul remained in the danger zone to evacuate the last survivors. The stellar collapse was accelerating, and they had perhaps 2 hours before the supernova began and maybe 30 minutes after that, before the shockwave reached lethal intensity. Every second counted as they raced against cosmic forces that could not be negotiated with or delayed. The final phase of the rescue operation began as the new soul descended toward the Keith homeworld one last time, while radiation levels climbed toward lethal intensity. The ship's hull glowed from stellar radiation, while her crew worked in full protective gear to bring the remaining refugees. The new soul screamed through the superheated atmosphere of the dying Keth homeworld as Captain Li Jun and his crew made their final desperate run to evacuate the last 300,000 refugees. The ship's hull plates glowed cherry red from radiation exposure, while her engines operated beyond all safety specifications in a race against stellar death itself. Every system aboard the vessel was pushed to its absolute limit as they loaded the final survivors into hibernation chambers that had been improvised from cargo holds and maintenance spaces. Dr. Park Hana maintained communication with the hibernating Keth refugees and discovered something remarkable happening within the ship's modified structure. The dormant aliens were somehow interfacing with the vessel's quantum systems through their crystalline biology in ways that human science could not explain. Their silicon-based neural networks were creating resonance patterns that actually stabilized the ship's hyperspace drive and strengthened its structural integrity beyond normal specifications. Lieutenant Kim Tae watched his navigation displays with growing alarm as the Keth star entered its final moments of collapse. The stellar core was compressing under unimaginable gravitational forces, while fusion reactions became chaotic and produced massive energy surges that swept across the system like waves of destruction. The mathematical model showed they had less than 10 minutes before the supernova began, and perhaps 3 minutes after that, to reach minimum safe distance. Engineer Yu Bin worked frantically with her team to keep the overloaded systems functioning, as the ship carried nearly 1 million beings through space in conditions that should have been impossible. The life support processors were operating at 400% capacity, while the artificial gravity generators struggled to maintain stable fields throughout the expanded habitation areas. Warning lights flashed throughout the vessel as automated systems reported cascade failures in multiple critical systems. The breakthrough came when young Keth Neela awakened from her hibernation and began communicating directly with the ship's computer systems through her crystalline neural structure. Her natural ability to process quantum information allowed her to interface with human technology in ways that created entirely new capabilities. She showed Engineer Yu Bin how Keth consciousness could merge with artificial intelligence to create hybrid systems that were more powerful than either species could achieve alone. Dr. Nam Su discovered that the hibernating Keth were not simply dormant passengers but were actively contributing to the ship's operations through their shared crystalline matrix. Their combined neural processing power was solving navigation problems and optimizing system performance in real time, while their physical structure reinforced the vessel's framework against the stresses of emergency hyperspace travel. The ship had become a living organism that was part human technology and part alien biology. The final evacuation was completed just as the Keth star reached critical collapse and began the supernova explosion that would destroy their entire solar system. Captain Lee Jun gave the order to jump to hyperspace, while stellar radiation levels climbed beyond anything his instruments could measure. The new Sol's engines ignited in a desperate attempt to escape the expanding wall of nuclear fire that was racing toward them at significant fractions of light speed. The hyperspace jump should have been impossible for a ship carrying such massive overloads, but the hybrid human-Keth systems performed beyond all theoretical limits. Keth leader Voss and engineer Toth worked directly with the human crew to create resonance fields that allowed the vessel to slip between dimensions while carrying nearly 1 million refugees. The jump was rough and dangerous, but it carried them away from certain death toward the safety of open space. Captain O Min aboard the Busan Hope and Captain Bei Wan commanding the Daejeon Runner watched their sensors as the new Sol appeared on their displays after successfully escaping the supernova explosion. All 3 ships had survived the rescue mission and were carrying the entire Keth civilization to safety in the first successful interspecies evacuation in galactic history. The impossible had become reality through the combined efforts of 2 species who had never met before the crisis began. The Keth homeworld died in a spectacular display of nuclear fire that lit up half the galaxy as their star exploded with the force of billions of hydrogen bombs detonating simultaneously. The expanding shockwaves sterilized everything within 50 light-years, while electromagnetic pulses disrupted communications across multiple star systems. But not a single Keth life was lost, because humans had decided that some things were more important than political considerations or personal safety. The rescue fleet limped toward the nearest human colony, while their crews worked to repair damage from the emergency evacuation and the stress of carrying impossible passenger loads. The ships were scarred and battered, but they were intact, and their precious cargo of alien refugees was safe in hibernation chambers that had been created through the collaboration of 2 completely different forms of life and technology. Young Neela remained awake during the journey and served as translator between the species while the adult Keth recovered from their ordeal in protective hibernation. Her natural curiosity and linguistic abilities made her the perfect ambassador for establishing communication protocols and cultural exchange programs. She learned human languages with remarkable speed while teaching the crew about Keth history and philosophy and art. The most profound revelation came when Neela explained to Dr. Nam Su how the rescue had changed Keth's understanding of morality and civilization. For centuries they had been taught that advanced species acted only from rational self-interest, and that altruistic behavior was primitive and inefficient. But humans had risked their lives to save strangers without expecting any reward or political advantage, and this challenged everything the Keth thought they knew about how intelligent beings should behave. Keth leader Voss awakened from hibernation as the rescue fleet approached human space and began composing messages to the galactic community about what had happened during their evacuation. His transmissions described how a young and supposedly primitive species had accomplished what the ancient great protectors had refused to attempt. Humanity had saved an entire civilization through courage and determination, rather than advanced technology or political authority. The response from the galactic community was immediate and overwhelming as species across known space tried to understand how humans had achieved the impossible rescue. Advanced civilizations that had ignored the Keth distress calls suddenly wanted to know everything about human capabilities and motivations. The rescue had announced humanity's presence to the galaxy in a way that no diplomatic mission could have accomplished. Dr. Park Hana received communications from dozens of species who wanted to establish contact with the humans who had proven themselves capable of moral action on a galactic scale. The messages came from civilizations that had been isolated by their own problems and disasters, but who now hoped that humanity might be willing to help them as they had helped the Keth. The rescue mission had created a reputation that would define Earth's role in galactic politics for generations. 6 months later, the Keth had established New Keth Colony on a world that was jointly terraformed through human and alien cooperation. The planet featured crystalline cities that sparkled in the light of twin suns, while human settlements provided agricultural and industrial support for the refugee population. The two species worked together to create a society that combined the best aspects of both cultures. Neela had become fluent in multiple human languages and served as the first Keth human ambassador while she continued her studies of comparative civilization and interspecies ethics. Her childhood experiences during the evacuation had given her unique insights into the differences between human and galactic approaches to moral decision-making. She often spoke about how the rescue had taught her that greatness was measured by the willingness to act when others would not. The hybrid technologies developed during the evacuation had created entirely new fields of scientific research as human and Keth engineers learned to combine their different approaches to problem-solving. Crystalline computer systems that merged artificial intelligence with biological neural networks were revolutionizing both species' understanding of consciousness and computation. The emergency cooperation had become permanent collaboration that benefited everyone involved. Captain Lee Jun received the Colonial Fleet's highest honors for his leadership during the rescue mission, but he always insisted that the real heroes were his crew members who had risked everything to save people they had never met. The rescue had proven that humanity deserved a place among the stars not because of their technology or military power, but because of their willingness to help others, regardless of the personal cost. The final message came from young Neela as she addressed the galactic community through communication networks that reached across known space. Her words were translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast to billions of beings who had heard about the human rescue mission. She spoke about how her people had learned aboard. We